7 months ago, Iran's currency traded at roughly 700,000 rials to the dollar. Today, it takes somewhere between 1.7 and 1.8 million rials to buy that same single dollar. That is not a gradual slide. That is a currency losing well over half its value in under a year, in a country where ordinary families are watching food prices climb by 70% or more, where meat has become something people plan around rather than something they simply buy, and where the government's own central bank has had to introduce a new, larger currency note twice in the span of a few months, just to keep pace with the collapsing value of its own money. This is the story that gets buried under every headline about airstrikes and naval standoffs and funeral processions this week, but it may end up mattering more in the long run than any single military engagement in this entire conflict. Iran is not simply fighting an external war right now, in other words. It is fighting to hold its own internal structure together, while that structure visibly comes apart underneath it. To put that currency collapse in some useful historical perspective, go back further than just this past year alone. The rial had already lost close to 90% of its value in the years since the United States withdrew from the earlier nuclear agreement back in 2018 and reimposed sanctions at that time. What's happened over the past 18 months isn't simply a new crisis layered onto an otherwise stable currency system. It's an acceleration of a long, grinding decline that has now reached a point where basic household arithmetic starts to break down entirely for ordinary families. When a currency moves this fast against a stable foreign benchmark, businesses can no longer reliably price imported goods, since the cost of restocking inventory can shift dramatically in the time between selling one batch of goods and buying the next. That's not an abstract economic concept. It's the exact mechanism that pushed Tehran's own merchant class, historically one of the most cautious and regime-aligned constituencies in the entire country, into the streets last December. Let's build this out properly and carefully, taking each piece in turn, because the pieces of this collapse have been unfolding for over a year, and putting them together tells a story considerably more serious than any single data point on its own could suggest. Start with the economy, because everything else in this entire unfolding story eventually traces back to it, one way or another. Iran's currency crisis did not begin with the war that erupted this year. It began accelerating after a 12-day conflict with Israel back in June of last year, when the rial lost more than 40% of its value in the aftermath. That was already a serious blow. What followed was worse. International sanctions, reimposed through the so-called snapback mechanism last September after years of gradual erosion in the earlier nuclear framework, hit an economy that had almost no cushion left to absorb further shocks. By December, the rial cratered to a record low on the open market. By early this year, it had fallen even further, at one point dropping 15% in the span of 2 days alone. Annual inflation, which had already been sitting above 30% for roughly 5 years running, climbed past 60% by some measures, and above 70% by others, depending on which specific basket of goods you're measuring. Independent estimates now place anywhere from a fifth to as much as half of the entire Iranian population living below the poverty line, a figure that has climbed sharply since before this current crisis even began. The government's own response to this collapse tells you almost everything you need to know about how constrained its options actually are. In early December, facing a shortage of hard currency it simply couldn't solve, the administration eliminated a preferential exchange rate that had kept the price of essential imports like cooking oil, livestock feed, and fertilizer artificially low for ordinary households. In its place, officials offered a monthly electronic subsidy coupon to roughly 80 million Iranians. The result was immediate and brutal. Average prices for goods and services jumped nearly 8% in a single month. That decision, forced by a government that genuinely could not find another way to manage its currency reserves, is what finally broke public patience after years of accumulated economic pain. That specific policy decision illustrates a dilemma that has trapped Iran's economic planners for years without any clean way out. The preferential exchange rate being eliminated was, by nearly every independent account, a deeply corrupt mechanism that primarily benefited politically connected importers and regime-linked firms able to access hard currency at rates far below the open market. Eliminating it was, in a narrow technical sense, a genuinely reformist move that a government serious about addressing entrenched insider privilege might reasonably pursue. But eliminating it without a credible, transparent replacement mechanism in place meant the immediate cost landed squarely on ordinary households buying basic goods, rather than on the well-connected interests who had been benefiting from the old system. That's the trap Iran's technocrats keep running into. The reforms that would genuinely address the country's structural economic problems tend to be the same reforms that inflict the most immediate visible pain on a population that has almost no capacity left to absorb additional hardship. On December 28th of last year, shopkeepers in Tehran's Grand Bazaar, the historic commercial heart of the country and a merchant class that has been intertwined with Iran's clerical establishment since well before the Islamic Republic even existed, shut their stores in protest. Within days, that single protest by a traditionally conservative, generally regime-aligned group had spread to 17 of Iran's 31 provinces. By New Year's Eve, it had reached all 31. Students joined, oil sector workers joined, members of the truckers' union went on strike. That specific combination, merchants, students, industrial labor, and transportation workers, moving together at the same time, is precisely the kind of broad-based coalition that Iran's government has spent decades working to prevent from ever forming simultaneously, because it echoes the exact cross-class alliance that helped topple the Shah's government in 1979. When a government's own founding historical narrative includes a bazaar-led uprising, watching the bazaar shut its doors again is not a symbolic footnote. It's an alarm bell drawn directly from the regime's own institutional memory. It's worth understanding why the bazaar's participation specifically carries this much symbolic and practical weight, because it distinguishes this protest wave from other recent movements the government has weathered more successfully. Iran's merchant class has historically avoided aligning with student-led or urban middle-class protest movements, including the woman, life, freedom demonstrations a few years earlier, generally because senior bazaris have significant wealth and patronage relationships embedded inside the existing system, giving them far more to lose from genuine instability than to gain from disruption. When even a portion of that traditionally cautious constituency reaches the point of shutting down commerce in protest, it signals that the underlying economic pain has moved past what even Iran's most system-invested economic actors are willing to quietly absorb. That's a considerably more significant warning sign for the government than student protests alone would represent, precisely because the bazaar has always functioned as one of the regime's most reliable internal barometers of how much economic pain the broader population can actually tolerate before organized resistance becomes unavoidable. The government's response followed a familiar, brutal pattern. Security spending increased by nearly 150% in the proposed budget, while wage increases offered to ordinary workers amounted to only about 2/5 of the actual inflation rate, an imbalance that arguably deepened the very anger it was meant to calm. Iran's supreme leader at the time, Ali Khamenei, said publicly that the government would speak with protesters while simultaneously warning that what he called rioters would be put in their place. That combination of conciliatory language, paired with an explicit threat of force, set the tone for what followed. According to Iran's own Ministry of Health, a very large number of people were killed in the ensuing crackdown, among the highest tolls associated with any protest movement in the Islamic Republic's history. Internet access across the country was deliberately restricted for roughly a month, cutting the national network down to a fraction of its normal capacity. A shutdown, one economist estimated, cost the country somewhere between $20 and $90 billion in lost economic activity, depending on how you calculate the currency conversion, layered on top of an economy that had almost nothing left to spare. That internet shutdown deserves a moment of its own, because it illustrates the genuinely difficult position Iran's government finds itself managing whenever unrest reaches this scale. Cutting the national network is an effective way to disrupt protest coordination and slow the international spread of footage documenting the crackdown, but it comes at a direct, measurable cost to an economy that depends on digital banking, commercial transactions, and international trade communications to function at even a basic level. Every day of restricted connectivity is a day of lost commerce, delayed payments, and disrupted supply chains, on top of whatever political benefit the government gains from limiting information flow. That trade-off, sacrificing real economic output specifically to contain unrest, is itself a symptom of just how narrow the government's available options had become by the time protests reached this scale. A government with more room to maneuver would have other tools available. Iran, by this point, was choosing between bad options and worse ones. Then, in the final week of February, before this protest movement had even fully receded, before the currency crisis had stabilized, before the underlying anger had anywhere to go, the United States and Israel launched a joint military campaign against Iran that killed the country's supreme leader in its opening hours and plunged the nation into open war on top of everything else it was already struggling to survive. Think about the sequencing here, because it matters enormously for understanding how deep this crisis actually runs. Iran did not enter this war from a position of economic strength interrupted by conflict. It entered a full-scale war while its own population was still recovering from a currency collapse, a mass protest movement, and a violent internal crackdown that had killed a significant number of its own citizens only weeks earlier. The war didn't create Iran's internal fragility. It landed directly on top of fragility that was already there, and arguably still unresolved. There's a strategic dimension to that timing worth considering as well, even though it remains speculative. Whether or not American and Israeli planners specifically factored Iran's domestic instability into their calculations about when to launch this campaign, the practical effect was the same, regardless of intent. A government already managing an unprecedented cross-class protest movement, already grappling with a currency in freefall, already trying to project confidence to a population that had just watched security forces kill a significant number of its own citizens, suddenly had to simultaneously defend against a coordinated foreign military campaign targeting its most senior leadership. Very few governments anywhere could absorb that combination of simultaneous internal and external shocks without showing serious strain, and Iran's leadership structure has shown exactly that strain in the months since. The war made everything worse, predictably. Reporting from inside the country describes prices climbing a further 6% during the current conflict alone, even as the rial continued sliding on the black market. Factories, energy facilities, bridges, and railways have been destroyed in strikes, leaving significant numbers of Iranians unemployed on top of an economy that was already shedding jobs before the war even began. An individual with direct knowledge of Iran's internal establishment told journalists that officials themselves view the economy as the country's single greatest vulnerability, its genuine Achilles heel, with real internal fear that continued financial strain could eventually threaten the government's basic ability to pay its own employees. That's an extraordinary admission for insiders to be making, even anonymously, about a government that spends enormous resources projecting total strength and control to the outside world. The failure of the ceasefire framework to produce sanctions, relief, or unlock Iran's frozen overseas assets has only deepened this specific vulnerability. Oil exports, which generated an estimated $30 billion last year and historically accounted for roughly a quarter of total government revenue, remain constrained by the ongoing standoff over the Strait of Hormuz and by the broader sanctions regime still in place. The Revolutionary Guard itself, which handles roughly half of the country's oil exports and had been counting on collecting substantial toll revenue from ships transiting the strait, sees that specific revenue stream directly threatened by any sustained American naval pressure in the region. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it means the very organization currently positioning itself as the most powerful actor inside Iran's uncertain post-Khamenei leadership structure is simultaneously watching its own primary source of independent revenue come under direct external threat, a squeeze that could weaken its financial leverage over the rest of the security and patronage networks it depends on to maintain internal control. That financial squeeze on the Guard specifically carries implications beyond simple institutional bookkeeping. The Revolutionary Guard has spent decades building an economic empire that extends well beyond its formal military role, controlling construction conglomerates, telecommunications interests, and significant shares of the country's energy sector, generating revenue streams that fund not just its military operations, but an extensive patronage network extending into Iran's broader economy and political system. When that revenue base comes under sustained pressure, the Guard's ability to maintain loyalty throughout that patronage network, paying the salaries, contracts, and favors that keep its allied officials, businessmen, and lower-ranking commanders satisfied, becomes correspondingly harder to sustain. An organization that governs partly through coercion and partly through financial reward becomes considerably more fragile once the reward side of that equation starts drying up, even if its coercive capacity remains fully intact. Now layer the leadership crisis on top of all of this economic strain, because the two are not separate problems. They are the same problem, viewed from different angles. Ali Khamenei was killed in the opening hours of this war, alongside his wife and other family members. His son, Mojtaba, widely understood to be the intended successor for years beforehand, was reportedly wounded in the same strike, suffering facial and leg injuries according to American intelligence assessments. Iran's Assembly of Experts, the body constitutionally responsible for selecting a new supreme leader, reportedly confirmed Mojtaba in early March, in a process shrouded in almost total secrecy, with several members of that same assembly staying away from the vote entirely in apparent protest against what they viewed as the imposition of hereditary succession inside a system explicitly built on rejecting monarchy. At his own inauguration, he wasn't present. A cardboard cutout stood in for him. Since that appointment, Mojtaba Khamenei has never once appeared in public. Not on video, not in an audio recording, not in a single verified photograph. Every statement attributed to him has been read aloud by a state television anchor, while a still image is displayed on screen. Iran currently finds itself in the middle of a 6-day state funeral for the late supreme leader, running from the 4th of July through the 9th, an event specifically built around the assumption that this would be the moment his son finally stepped into public view and cemented his legitimacy. He has not appeared at a single major event across that entire mourning period. 3 of his brothers have stood beside the family's coffins in his place, and with the final burial in Mashhad just 2 days away, Iranian security officials have reportedly told him he cannot attend that either, citing specific fears that he could be killed or tracked to wherever he's currently hiding. The symbolic cost of that continued absence compounds with each passing day of the funeral rather than fading into the background. Iranian state media has clearly tried to manage the narrative around his invisibility, referring to him at times using language normally reserved for the country's disabled war veterans, an attempt to frame his condition sympathetically that has arguably raised more questions about the severity of his injuries than it has answered. Meanwhile, ordinary Iranians, even under one of the most heavily monitored information environments on Earth, have turned his absence into open mockery on social media, a genuinely remarkable development inside a system whose entire governing model depends on the supreme leader being perceived as a figure of unassailable religious and political authority. A leader who becomes a punchline for being unseen is having that authority quietly eroded in a way no amount of official messaging can easily repair. Analysts tracking Iran's internal power structure describe his actual authority as fundamentally dependent on the Revolutionary Guard's continued backing, rather than existing independently of it, with real power reportedly consolidated by figures like the Guard's former intelligence chief, while opposition to his selection came from other senior officials, including the Secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, a figure some analysts now consider the genuine power broker operating behind the scenes, while the nominal supreme leader remains invisible. That is not a stable, settled leadership transition. That is a country being run, at least in practice, by whichever faction currently holds the most operational leverage inside a security and clerical establishment that has lost the one figure who spent over 3 decades holding those competing factions in rough balance. It's worth remembering just how significant that 3-decade balancing role actually was, because its absence is easy to underestimate from the outside. Iran's political system has always featured genuinely competing centers of power: the clerical establishment in Qom, the elected presidency, the Revolutionary Guard's own independent military and economic empire, layered on top of each other in ways that require constant, active management to prevent open conflict between them. A functioning supreme leader serves as the arbiter holding that fragile equilibrium together, someone with enough independent religious and political standing that every competing faction accepts his authority to settle disputes between them. Remove that arbiter suddenly, replace him with a successor who cannot or will not appear in public, and every one of those competing power centers is left to negotiate its relative position with considerably less restraint than it would otherwise exercise, precisely because the figure whose job it was to referee between them is functionally absent from the process entirely. Every one of these threads reinforces every other one. A population already furious over economic collapse and a violent crackdown is now watching its government fight a war it did not choose and cannot clearly explain how it will end. A leadership structure already fractured by economic mismanagement is now missing its most senior unifying figure entirely, replaced by a successor who cannot safely appear in public. A Revolutionary Guard trying to project total strength through public threats and funeral choreography is simultaneously watching its own primary revenue source come under direct external pressure. And a diplomatic track in Doha meant to resolve all of this depends on a coherent Iranian negotiating position that increasingly looks like it might not actually exist behind the funeral banners and the defiant press statements. Consider how this reinforcing cycle plays out at the level of an individual Iranian official trying to actually govern day to day. A provincial administrator responsible for managing local subsidies and price controls is working with a currency that can move double digits against the dollar within a single week, making any economic planning beyond the very short term nearly impossible. A security commander responsible for protecting senior officials is operating without clear direction from the top of the chain of command, since the nominal head of state has not been seen in months and cannot be consulted directly on operational decisions the way a visible functioning leader normally would be. A diplomat sitting across the table in Doha is negotiating on behalf of a government whose actual decision-making authority remains genuinely unclear even to many of Iran's own senior officials, let alone to the American and allied negotiators trying to gauge whether any agreement reached will actually be honored once signed. Multiply that kind of operational confusion across every level of Iran's government simultaneously, and you get a much clearer picture of why outside observers increasingly describe this specific moment as something categorically different from the routine crises the Islamic Republic has weathered in the past. This is worth being precise about, because collapsing from the inside does not necessarily mean an imminent, dramatic government collapse in the way that phrase might suggest. Iran's security services remain considerably stronger and more resourced than the protest movements challenging them, and the country's ruling economic elite, including the wealthiest and most established members of the bazaar merchant class, generally has far more to lose from genuine regime collapse and the chaos that would likely follow than it does from continuing to operate inside the current, deeply flawed system. Iran's opposition, both inside the country and among its exiled diaspora, remains fragmented and divided along lines that go back decades, without a single unifying figure or organization capable of credibly stepping into a power vacuum if one actually opened. Previous rounds of protest in this country, including the massive woman, life freedom movement a few years earlier, generated similar hopes of imminent transformation that ultimately did not materialize, at least not on the timeline observers expected. Betting on rapid, dramatic collapse has been a consistently losing bet when it comes to predicting Iran's internal politics over the past several decades. It's worth naming explicitly why that betting record matters here. Outside observers, particularly members of Iran's exiled diaspora who understandably want to see the system replaced, have repeatedly interpreted moments of visible strain as the beginning of the end, only to watch the government adapt, crack down, and stabilize once again. That repeated pattern should inject real humility into any confident prediction about where the current strain actually leads. The specific combination of pressures right now may genuinely be more severe than anything the system has faced since 1979, given how many of them are converging simultaneously rather than arriving one at a time. But severity of pressure and inevitability of collapse are not the same thing, and Iran's modern history offers considerably more examples of the government absorbing severe pressure and surviving than examples of it actually breaking under that pressure. But there is a meaningful difference between rapid collapse and genuine structural erosion, and what's happening inside Iran right now looks considerably more like the second than a prediction of the first. A currency that has lost more than half its value in under a year. Inflation running near or above 70% on basic goods. Protests that pulled in merchants, students, oil workers, and truckers simultaneously. An alliance the government has spent decades trying to prevent from forming. A significant, still not fully counted number of citizens killed in the resulting crackdown. A war layered directly on top of all of that unresolved anger, destroying infrastructure, and further constraining an economy that had almost no slack left to give. A supreme leader killed in the opening hours of that war. A successor who has not shown his face in nearly 4 months, and may not even be able to attend his own father's burial. And a Revolutionary Guard trying to hold the entire apparatus together through public displays of defiance while its own financial position weakens by the week. None of these individual pressures would likely be fatal to the Iranian government on its own. Governments survive currency crises. Governments survive protest movements, even large and violent ones. Governments survive leadership transitions, even chaotic and poorly managed ones. Governments survive wars, even costly and humiliating ones. What's genuinely unusual about Iran's current situation is the sheer number of these pressures converging on the exact same government at the exact same moment, each one compounding the others rather than unfolding in isolation, each one draining resources and legitimacy the government would otherwise be able to devote toward managing whichever single crisis it happened to be facing at any other point in its history. There's a useful analogy here to how structural engineers think about load-bearing failure. A single crack in a support beam rarely brings down an entire structure on its own. Most buildings are engineered with enough redundancy to absorb isolated damage without total failure. What causes catastrophic collapse is usually multiple simultaneous stresses interacting in ways the original design never accounted for, each one reducing the structure's remaining capacity to absorb the next. Iran's governing system was not designed, explicitly or otherwise, to withstand a currency collapse, a cross-class protest movement, a violent leadership decapitation, an invisible and possibly incapacitated successor, and a crumbling regional proxy network, all bearing down on the same load-bearing joints simultaneously. Whether that combination proves to be the specific stress the structure cannot ultimately absorb, or simply another severe test it manages to survive in a weakened but intact form, is precisely the open question hanging over everything else in this story. There's also a regional dimension to this internal strain that deserves attention, because Iran's ability to project strength abroad has always depended heavily on resources and political capital it could spare from managing problems at home. The network of allied militias and proxy forces Iran built up over decades in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen has been unraveling steadily throughout this same period. The government in Syria that once anchored Iran's overland supply routes collapsed entirely. Hezbollah is operating under a ceasefire framework it has publicly denounced as humiliating, facing sustained pressure to disarm. Iraq's prime minister set a formal deadline for Iran-aligned militias in that country to disarm or face direct military consequences. Every one of those setbacks reduces the external outlets Iran has traditionally used to project strength and distract from domestic problems, which means whatever pressure exists internally now has fewer external release valves available to relieve it than at almost any point in the Islamic Republic's history. This regional erosion and the domestic economic collapse feed each other in ways that compound rather than simply coexist. Maintaining a regional proxy network the size of what Iran built over the past several decades requires substantial, ongoing financial investment, funding fighters, weapons transfers, and political patronage across 4 or 5 different countries simultaneously. And Iran running a currency crisis this severe, with a Revolutionary Guard watching its own oil revenue come under direct threat, has considerably less capacity to sustain that kind of expensive regional investment than it did even 2 years ago, which means the same economic collapse driving domestic unrest is also simultaneously weakening Iran's ability to prop up the exact regional proxies that once gave it strategic depth and leverage against direct external pressure. The country is being squeezed from both directions at once, an eroding foreign policy position feeding a worsening domestic economy, and a worsening domestic economy accelerating the erosion of that same foreign policy position. What happens next depends on questions that remain genuinely unresolved as of today. Whether Mojtaba Khamenei ever makes a real public appearance, or whether his absence simply hardens into the new normal, with this Revolutionary Guard governing indefinitely in his name without requiring him to be seen at all. Whether the currency stabilizes even modestly if the Doha talks eventually produce sanctions relief, or whether it continues its slide regardless of what gets signed on paper. Whether the anger that drove hundreds of thousands into the streets last December has genuinely been suppressed, or whether it's simply waiting for the next specific trigger, a fuel price hike, another currency shock, another round of visible corruption, to reignite on a scale the security services can no longer contain as effectively as they did the first time. Each of those questions carries its own timeline, and they won't necessarily resolve together. The succession question could settle relatively quickly if Mojtaba simply appears at some point in the coming weeks and the Guard's backing holds, while the economic crisis could easily drag on for years, regardless of what happens with the funeral or the Doha negotiations, since currency stabilization typically requires sustained structural reform and renewed international confidence rather than any single diplomatic breakthrough. It's entirely possible for Iran's leadership question to resolve in the government's favor while its economic foundation continues eroding underneath whoever ends up holding power, which would represent a strange kind of partial stability, a settled hierarchy, sitting atop a genuinely unstable economic base. Now, that combination, political continuity without economic recovery, may turn out to be the most likely outcome of all the scenarios currently being discussed, and it is arguably the hardest one to resolve cleanly in either direction. What is not in question is the direction of travel. Every major indicator, currency value, inflation, poverty, regional proxy strength, leadership continuity, public trust, has moved steadily and consistently in the same negative direction over the past year and a half, and none of them show any sign of reversing course simply because a funeral procession moves through Tehran's streets this week, or because a memorandum gets signed in Doha next month. Iran's government has survived worse crises taken individually, one at a time, spread out across the decades of its existence. Whether it can continue absorbing this many of them simultaneously, indefinitely, without either a genuine course correction or a genuine rupture, is the question that actually matters here. And it is a question that neither this week's funeral nor next month's negotiations are likely to answer on their own.